Elizabeth and her government. This section of the course can be split into three parts: Elizabeth and her court, Elizabeth and her parliament, including opposition from the Puritans, Elizabeth and her people, including local government, propaganda and censorship. So our first section we're going to look at is Elizabeth and her court. So it's important that you understand the different parts to Elizabeth's court, and these can be split into the royal court, the Privy Chamber and the Privy Council. So the royal court consisted of about 500 courtiers, and they lived with Elizabeth and worked for her. Courtiers were personally selected by the Queen, and they competed for power and influence. Here, Elizabeth used patronage to gain support. So patronage, giving particular men important duties or privileges. Patronage, however, caused competition and factional rivalry. So groups joined forces against each other, but it also ensured loyalty to the Queen. This idea of the court being a balancing act for the Queen. They would be used to lavish banquets, plays and tournaments. They were put on to entertain her courtiers. Elizabeth was keen on mixing business with pleasure. These also acted as propaganda, and they glorified the Queen's image. In the summer, the Queen and her courtiers went on royal progresses, where she toured the country, staying with nobles, allowing her to see her people and to be seen. So progresses boosted the impression of royal power. Now this brings me on to the Privy Chamber, okay, not to be confused with the Privy Council. So the Privy Chamber, so courtiers did not have constant access to the Queen. She had her own private space, and this was called the Privy, so the private, the chamber, the room, so a private room. With her own servants and ladies in waiting, this private household was at the very heart of the court. Only her most trusted courtiers were ever invited into the Privy Chamber. Now the next part to Elizabeth's court were her Privy Council, and these were her small group of key ministers, and they consisted of 19 members. The Privy Council was a group of ministers then selected by Elizabeth to help her govern the country. It met at court almost daily. Her first council was a clever compromise of nobles. Later it became an effective group of full-time politicians drawn from the gentry. And her two most famous or closest, most important ministers were William Cecil and Sir Francis Walsingham. Both held the position of a Secretary of State. Now, 1590 was a key date for Elizabeth and her court. As the 1590s, this decade was quite challenging for Elizabeth. So Elizabeth's closest advisors died. So Walsingham in 1590 and Cecil in 1598. This opened up opportunities for new courtiers to compete to gain influence. England experienced a series of bad harvests, famine, plagues and rising poverty. England's expensive war with Spain dragged on. Elizabeth had no heir so there was uncertainty around the succession, which caused much anxiety and debate within Parliament, or they wanted to debate it. And Elizabeth was becoming less popular. Her previously tight control of the royal court was breaking down. And this could be seen with Essex and the rebellion in 1601. So Essex was one of the Queen's favourites, However, the relationship broke down. Um, Essex was banned from court in 1600s after an argument with Elizabeth, and he tried to lead a rebellion in 1601. He did actually underestimate how much support there was for Elizabeth. He was arrested and executed. So next, we'll have a look at Elizabeth and her Parliament, including opposition from the Puritans. So a key thing to remember around Elizabeth, around the Elizabethan government, was that it was not very democratic, right? Like it is today. So the Queen ruled mostly by what were called royal proclamations, so royal orders that had the force of law. However, if Elizabeth wanted to change the laws or raise taxes, she summoned Parliament. So she did need Parliament for this to happen. The Queen could open and close Parliament whenever she liked, and actually Parliament only sat for 35 months out of a 45-year reign. That was the least than any other Tudor monarch. MPs were not elected. Like I said, it wasn't really a democratic government. They were selected by local lords. And between 1580 and 1603, Elizabeth called Parliament more often than previously because she needed laws and financial support to deal with religious threats and war with Spain. So Elizabeth had various ways to control Parliament, and she often compromised. Most of her requests were granted without difficulty as her reign continued. Towards the end, we see particularly Puritan MPs begin to oppose her. So let's have a look then at this, the ins and outs then of what could be discussed in Parliament. So Elizabeth and her ministers decided what Parliament could discuss. The Privy Councillors organised parliamentary business, and some served as MPs as well. The Queen appointed the Speaker, who decided on the agenda. Some topics such as religion, marriage, foreign affairs and the succession were not allowed to be raised. She had tight control over what was going to be discussed. Like I said, in later years of her reign, Elizabeth faced greater opposition or criticism from Puritan MPs. So some MPs grew in confidence and started to discuss sensitive topics around religion, around the succession. Even Privy Councillors such as Cecil and Walsingham stirred up off-limits issues such as foreign policy or the succession, which they wanted the Queen to confront. The Puritans wanted freedom of speech for MPs. 2 Puritans were hanged in 1583 for putting forward such views. So this shows that ultimately Elizabeth did have the final say in issues surrounding government and Parliament. In November, another example of this, in November 1579, John Stubbs, a Puritan MP, wrote a pamphlet criticising Elizabeth's proposal marriage to the French Catholic Duke of Anjou. Stubbs had his right hand cut off. And in 1593, Puritan MP Peter Wentworth was imprisoned in the Tower of London for urging Elizabeth to name a Protestant successor, and he actually died there 4 years later. Another issue in Parliament was monopolies. So a monopoly was the exclusive right to make or sell a product. Elizabeth had the right to grant or sell a monopoly to a favourite courtier. For example, she granted Walter Raleigh a monopoly of tin. MPs complained about monopolies in the 1597 Parliament, and this is where we see Elizabeth compromising. The Queen agreed to look into the issue, and she did later compromise, but not till 1601.